Nobody in that building understood what they were watching. Not the crowd packed into the new Regal Theater on South Stony Island Avenue. That February night in 1994, 3,000 people pressed together in one of Chicago's oldest and most storied venues, a room that had seen Nat King Cole and Ella Fitzgerald and Muddy Waters and James Brown stand on that same stage, a room with decades of memory in its walls. Not the opening acts who had already come and gone, leaving the stage to the headliner, the 22-year-old rapper from the Bay Area, who had spent the last 2 years becoming something that nobody had quite seen before. Not the security guards working the barricades along the front row, watching the crowd with the particular vigilance of people who understood that Tupac Shakur concerts had a specific energy to them, an electrical charge that lived somewhere between celebration and ignition, and most certainly not Tupac himself. He did not know, standing backstage at the new Regal Theater on February 27, 1994, that the version of himself he was about to carry onto that stage was already almost gone, that by November of that year, a bullet would tear through that body and change everything, that the young man who walked out under those lights that night, unguarded, unarmored, still capable of being surprised by the world, would be replaced by someone heavier and harder and more afraid, that this concert, in this room, in front of these 3,000 people, represented something he would never fully get back. He did not know any of that. He just knew he had a show to do. To understand what happened that night in Chicago, you have to understand what 1994 meant for Tupac Shakur. He was 22 years old and already too famous for his age, carrying a reputation that had been built on contradictions so large that journalists kept writing think pieces about them without ever quite resolving the central tension. Here was a man who made music about protecting black women, and then made headlines that complicated that image. Here was a man whose most commercially successful song was about tenderness, about dignity, about the kind of love that doesn't ask anything in return, and who had simultaneously built an entire public persona around hardness and defiance and the refusal to be soft. Keep Ya Head Up had been released in October 1993, the third single from Strictly For My Niggas, and it had done something unusual for a rap record in that era. It had crossed over not just in terms of charts, but in terms of emotional register. Women who had never listened to hip-hop were calling radio stations asking them to play it. Men who thought they had no patience for Tupac's music were finding themselves sitting in parked cars, unable to turn it off. Something in that song had located a nerve in the culture that nobody had known was exposed, and the response had been proportionate to the wound it dressed. Tupac had told interviewers that he wrote that song for the women who related to Brenda's Got a Baby, for the ones who had not been forgotten by him, even if the world had moved on. He meant it. The man who could be reckless and violent in other contexts became, in certain moments, someone who seemed to hold the grief of other people as carefully as if it were his own. That was the version of Tupac Shakur, who flew into Chicago in late February 1994 for a show at the new Regal Theater. The show was co-headlined by MC Lyte. The supporting acts included up-and-coming Chicago artists, Twista, Da Brat, a 17-year-old kid named Kanye West who performed before the headliners and who Tupac would have walked past backstage without knowing the name yet. The setlist included Out on Bail, the unreleased track that would become a statement about his relationship with the legal system, and Keep Ya Head Up, which had become by then something he understood he would perform for the rest of his career. Every show, every night, the song that meant something to people in a way that couldn't be controlled or predicted. He had no way to know that one of those people was in the front row that night. Her name was Alicia. She was 8 years old. Her mother, a woman named Sandra, had brought her to the show because Alicia had been asking for weeks. Keep Ya Head Up had been playing on the radio in their apartment on the South Side, and Alicia had attached herself to the song the way children attach themselves to things that make them feel seen in a world that generally doesn't notice them. She had memorized the parts she could understand. She had asked Sandra what certain words meant, and Sandra had explained what she could and skipped what she couldn't, and somehow the song had still worked on this 8-year-old the way it worked on grown women with grown problems. Sandra had saved for 3 weeks for the tickets. Front row was not available, but the seats they had were close enough. Third row center, close enough that you could see the performer's face, close enough to matter. The night was going the way nights like that go. The opening acts, the anticipation, the crowd working itself into the particular fever that only live music can generate, the collective agreement that something is about to happen that cannot be replicated anywhere else. Alicia had been vibrating with excitement from the moment they walked through the doors, holding her mother's hand tighter than usual, her eyes trying to take in everything at once. And then Tupac walked out. And something happened to Alicia that her mother had not prepared for and could not have prepared for. She started crying. Not the crying of sadness or fear, something harder to name than that. The particular overwhelm that comes when a child encounters something they have been holding in their chest as an idea, and then discovers that it is real, that it exists, that it can stand on a stage 30 feet away and be a person in the world. The gap between the song on the radio and the man performing it live had collapsed, and the collapse had broken something open in this 8-year-old girl in the third row. She cried through the first song. She cried through the second. Sandra put her arm around her, asked if she wanted to go, offered water, tried to help, but Alicia wasn't in distress. She was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the crying was not a problem to be solved, but a response to something real. By the third song, people around them had noticed. An 8-year-old crying in the front section of a Tupac Shakur concert was not a sight anyone had expected, and it had drawn the particular attention that unusual things draw in crowds. Quiet, sideways, not wanting to stare but unable not to. One of those people was a security guard working the barricade at the front of the section. He had been doing this job long enough to have seen everything. He had not seen this. He went backstage between songs. Tupac was mid-conversation with a crew member when the security guard appeared in the wings. The guard was brief. There was a little girl in the front section, he said. 8 years old, had been crying the whole show, didn't seem distressed exactly, just overwhelmed. Her mother was with her. They seemed okay, but he thought Tupac should know. The thing about Tupac Shakur in 1994, the thing that gets lost in the later mythology built around his harder edges, was how quickly he could move between registers. He was mid-performance, mid-show, mid-adrenaline, and the information about an 8-year-old crying in the third row reorganized his attention in seconds. Not as a calculation, not as a public relations decision, something simpler than that. He walked back to the wing's entrance and looked out at the crowd. It took him a moment to locate them. When he did, a small girl with her mother's arm around her, face wet, looking at the stage with an expression that Tupac would later describe to people close to him as the most honest thing he had seen in a long time. Something in his face changed. He finished the song he had been about to start. He walked to the center of the microphone, and he stopped the show. Not with drama, not with announcement. He simply stopped, and the band understood to stop with him, and the crowd understood that something had shifted. "Hold on," Tupac said into the microphone. His voice had dropped from performance mode to something lower, more personal. 3,000 people went quiet in the way crowds go quiet, when a performer suddenly becomes a person in front of them. "Hold on just a second." He walked to the edge of the stage. He looked down into the third row. "Little mama," he said. Not loudly, not performing, just talking. "Hey, I see you." The crowd shifted. 3,000 people trying to understand what they were witnessing, turning to see who he was talking to, finding the small girl in the third row, and then looking back at the stage. Alicia looked up at him. "You've been crying this whole time," Tupac said. "What's going on with you?" She didn't answer, couldn't, but she kept looking at him with that expression. He stayed at the edge of the stage for a moment, looking at her, and then he looked at Sandra, and Sandra looked back at him and gave the small shrug of a mother who has already tried to explain what is happening and knows there's no short version. Tupac nodded like that, made sense to him. "You know that song?" he said to Alicia. "Keep Ya Head Up? That one yours?" She nodded. He was quiet for a moment. 3,000 people were quiet with him. "That song is for you," Tupac said. "That's always been for you. You know that, right?" What happened in the next minutes is the part of this story that people who were in that building have been trying to describe accurately for 30 years without quite succeeding, because it belongs to the category of live experiences that resist compression into language. Tupac crouched down at the edge of the stage. He reached down and took Alicia's hand, this 8-year-old in the third row whose crying had stopped the show, and he said something to her quietly that the microphone didn't fully capture, something that was between them. And then he stood up and looked at the crowd and said, "Without performance, without calculation, just as a statement of fact, this is why we do this right here." He looked back at Alicia. "You want to hear it?" he said. You want me to do Keep Ya Head Up right now, just for you? She nodded again. He turned to his band. He called the song. And he performed it differently than he had ever performed it before. Not to the crowd, but to this one child in the third row, making eye contact with her through the whole first verse, watching her face change as the song she had been living with in her chest came off the stage and wrapped around her, watching the crying transform into something that had no name but was recognizable as the thing that happens when a person discovers they are not alone in what they are carrying. 3,000 people sang along quietly. Not the usual roar of a crowd feeding off collective energy. Something softer. More like a room of people who understood they had been invited into a private moment and were trying to be worthy of the invitation. When the song ended, Tupac looked at Alicia for a long moment. "Keep your head up," he said to her directly. Just that. Then to the crowd, "All of y'all, keep your head up." He finished the show. He performed everything on his set list, and he gave the crowd exactly what they had come for. The energy and the presence and the performance that Tupac Shakur concerts had already become known for. But something had changed in the room that didn't change back. Something had been introduced into the atmosphere of that building that stayed in the air for the rest of the night. The people who were there talk about it differently depending on who you ask. Some of them talk about it as a musical experience, about the way the performance felt more honest after that moment, as if the artifice between performer and audience had dissolved. Some of them talk about it as a human experience, about the particular gift of watching a young man at the height of his powers choose to stop everything for a child who needed to know that the song she had been holding was real. Sandra, Alicia's mother, found her way backstage after the show through a chain of people who had seen what happened and understood that the meeting should continue. Tupac spent 20 minutes with them in the backstage hallway. He signed Alicia's ticket stub. He talked to her about music and about Chicago and about the things a 22-year-old man who grew up without stability thinks about when he is talking to an 8-year-old girl who found something in his music that her world hadn't given her. He told her to stay in school. He told her to take care of her mother. He told her that whatever she was feeling when she heard that song was the right thing to feel, and she didn't need to explain it to anyone. She was crying again by the time they left. Different kind of crying. 9 months later, Tupac Shakur was shot 5 times in the lobby of Quad Recording Studios in New York City. He survived, but the version of him that walked out of the new Regal Theater that February night in Chicago, the one who crouched at the edge of the stage for an 8-year-old girl, who stopped his show without calculation or strategy, who told a child that the song was always for her, that version had a shorter life ahead of it than anyone in that building knew. The shooting changed him in ways that people close to him documented carefully and consistently. He became more guarded, more suspicious, more focused on the external war, and less able to access the interior space from which songs like Keep Ya Head Up had come. He made more music after 1994 than before it, and some of it was extraordinary, but the quality of openness that had produced that moment in Chicago, the willingness to be interrupted, to stop the show, to crouch at the edge of the stage and take a crying child's hand, became harder to access. He was dead by 25. The last show he ever played was at the House of Blues in Los Angeles on August 15, 1996. 3 weeks later, he was shot again in Las Vegas. 7 days after that, he was gone. People who study his catalog talk about the arc of his career in terms of albums and chart positions and cultural impact. But there is another arc, less discussed, that runs through his live performances. The arc of a young man who began performing with such rawness that an 8-year-old's tears could stop him mid-show, who ended performing with such ferocity that the performances became legendary not for their tenderness, but for their force. Both were real. Both were Tupac. But the Chicago night in 1994 shows you something about the one that existed first, the one that was there before the shootings and the prison and the war that consumed his final years. The one who could hear about a crying child between songs and reorganize an entire show around making sure she knew she was seen. Sandra kept the ticket stub. She kept the memory of the backstage hallway and what Tupac said to her daughter. When Tupac died in September 1996, she sat Alicia down, who was 10 years old by then, and tried to explain what had been lost. Alicia is in her late 30s now. She has told this story in her own life, to her own children, in the way that people tell the stories that shape them. She has told it as a story about what it means to be seen by someone who didn't have to see you. She has told it as a story about what live performance is supposed to do, She has told it as a story about a young man who was given enormous power and sometimes, in the most unguarded moments, used it exactly right. The new Regal Theater still stands on South Stony Island Avenue in Chicago. It has been through decades of history since 1994. Through renovations and reinventions and all the things that happen to old rooms in old cities. The stage is the same stage. Nobody put a plaque on it for the night. Tupac stopped his show for an 8-year-old girl. Nobody marked the spot at the edge of that stage where he crouched down and took her hand, but the people who were in that room remember it. They remember it not as a great performance moment, not as something that made the concert better or more memorable in a commercial sense, but as the moment they understood something about why the music existed in the first place. Not for arenas, not for records, not for the industry that would spend decades arguing over what his legacy was worth. For an 8-year-old girl in the third row, who had been carrying a song in her chest and needed to know it was real. That is what Tupac Shakur was, in the best version of himself, before the world made him into something harder. That is what he showed a room full of Chicago people on a February night in 1994, and nobody in that building knew it was almost over.